When two people stop contacting each other, the noise of words disappears, but the inner dialogue becomes louder. Silence does not mean nothing is happening. It means the external channel is closed and the internal one is fully open. This is where real emotional processing begins for both sides. At first, the mind tries to protect itself. It tells a story that makes the separation feel logical. This is for the best. When needed space, it's over. These thoughts create a sense of control. Control reduces anxiety. It allows the nervous system to relax, at least on the surface. But once the initial calm passes, something deeper starts to move. Without daily interaction, without messages, without reassurance, the emotional system no longer has distractions. There is no new input to replace the old. So the mind turns inward. It starts reviewing what was felt, what was said, and what was left unresolved. This is reflection. Reflection is not the same as rumination. Rumination is stuck in pain. Reflection is the mind trying to integrate experience, to understand meaning, to make sense of attachment and loss. And when contact stops on both sides, reflection happens naturally because there is nothing else to focus on emotionally. Memories surface, not just events, but feelings. The way it felt to be close, the way it felt to be misunderstood, the way it felt to be desired, the way it felt to be disappointed. These emotional imprints do not disappear just because communication stops. In fact, they become clearer. Silence removes the clutter of new interaction and leaves only what was already stored in the nervous system. This is when both people begin to confront the truth of what the connection actually meant to them. Not what they said it meant, not what they wanted it to mean, but what it felt like in the body and mind. For some, this reflection brings relief. They realize the connection was heavy, draining, or misaligned. For others, it brings a quiet ache, a sense that something meaningful is now absent. And often, it brings a mix of both. Because most connections are not purely good or purely bad, they are emotionally complex. Silence gives space for this complexity to be felt. When communication stops, the emotional system no longer gets regulation from the other person. There is no voice to calm it, no presence to anchor it, so it begins to self-regulate. And in that process, it replays what once provided emotional stimulation or safety. This is why people often think more about each other during no contact than they did during constant communication. Presence can numb, absence sensitizes, absence heightens awareness. Both the man and the woman, in their own way, start to ask internal questions. What did that connection really give me? What did I feel when I was with them? What am I feeling now without them? What part of me was attached? What part of me is relieved? These questions are not always conscious. They show up as moods, dreams, sudden thoughts, emotional waves, or moments of nostalgia. Reflection also brings accountability. In silence, there is no one to argue with, no one to justify, no one to persuade. There is only the self, and the self begins to examine its own role. What was done? What was avoided? What was taken for granted? What was feared? This is where growth begins if a person is willing to be honest. Because reflection is the doorway to self-awareness. And self-awareness is the foundation of emotional maturity. When both sides are in silence, both are being invited into this internal process, not at the same pace, not in the same way. But the invitation is there. Some resist it. They distract themselves, suppress, stay busy, avoid feeling. Others lean into it and begin to understand their patterns, their needs, their wounds, their expectations. Either way, the emotional system is working. Silence is not emptiness. It is incubation. It is the space where emotional meaning is formed, clarified, and reevaluated. This is why no contact often leads to emotional shifts, sometimes even reversals. What felt certain begins to feel uncertain. What felt resolved begins to feel open. What felt over begins to feel incomplete. Or in some cases, what felt confusing becomes clear and final. The key is that silence removes illusion. It removes the illusion created by constant interaction, by habit, by comfort, by routine. It strips the connection down to its emotional core. And in that stillness, both the man and the woman are confronted with what they truly felt, not what they told themselves they felt. This is the beginning of emotional truth. Not because someone spoke it, but because silence made it impossible to ignore. When two people stop contacting each other, a strange psychological space opens up. The familiar rhythm of messages, calls, and shared moments is suddenly gone, and the mind is left with a gap. Human psychology does not tolerate empty space for long. When there is a gap, the mind fills it, and what it fills it with is memory, imagination, and meaning. At first, the silence may feel neutral or even relieving. There is less emotional stimulation, less pressure, less need to respond or explain. But as time passes, the absence becomes noticeable. The routines that once involved the other person now have empty slots. The moments that used to carry shared emotion now stand alone, and in these quiet spaces, the mind begins to wander back. Memory is not just a record of events, it is a record of feeling. When the present is quiet, the past becomes louder. The brain starts to replay scenes, conversations, expressions, and emotional tones, not in a logical order, but in the order of emotional intensity. The moments that carried the strongest feelings surface first. Laughter, closeness, conflict, vulnerability, comfort, tension. All of it rises not because the person chooses to think about it, but because the nervous system is trying to make sense of the emotional gap. Imagination then steps in. Because there is no new information, the mind begins to create it. It imagines what the other person might be doing, how they might be feeling, whether they are missing the connection, whether they have moved on. These imagined scenarios are not facts, but they feel emotionally real. And emotional reality often has more impact than actual reality. This is where meaning begins to form. The mind starts asking, what did that connection really mean? Not in words, but in feeling. Was it safety? Was it excitement? Was it validation? Was it familiarity? Was it purpose? The absence forces the emotional system to identify what role the other person played. When contact was constant, these roles were felt, but not examined. They were part of the background. In silence, they come into focus. The mind also begins to compare. It compares the emotional state of with you and without you. It compares how it felt to be seen, heard, supported, challenged, or desired with how it feels now in the quiet. This comparison is not always favorable or unfavorable. Sometimes it brings relief, sometimes longing, sometimes confusion. But it always brings clarity, because comparison reveals value. Value is often recognized not in possession but in absence. When something is no longer there, its function becomes clear. The emotional system realizes what was being provided, what was being taken for granted, and what was being tolerated. At the same time, meaning is layered onto the silence itself. Silence can be interpreted as strength, indifference, respect, rejection, growth, or loss, depending on the internal state of the person observing it. The same absence can feel peaceful one day and heavy the next. The mind keeps reinterpreting it, trying to find a narrative that makes emotional sense. This is why no contact is rarely emotionally static. The story changes inside. One day the silence means freedom, another day it means loss, another day it means unfinished business, another day it means acceptance. Each interpretation shapes how the past is remembered and how the future is imagined. And because there is no direct communication to correct or confirm these interpretations, the mind becomes the storyteller. It builds a version of reality based on emotion, memory, and projection. That version may or may not be accurate, but it feels real to the nervous system. This process happens on both sides. Each person is filling the gap in their own way, based on their own emotional patterns, attachment style, and level of self-awareness. One may focus on relief and independence. The other may focus on connection and loss. Or both may move through all of it in waves. What matters is that the silence becomes meaningful. It is no longer just the absence of words. It becomes a space loaded with emotional interpretation. A space where the mind tries to understand what the connection was, what it is now, and what it could have been. In this space, illusions fall away. There is no performance, no roles, no immediate reactions, only internal truth, and that truth, shaped by memory and meaning, begins to redefine how each person holds the connection in their emotional world. This is how silence transforms from nothing into something, not through communication, but through reflection, imagination, and emotional significance. And in that inner process, the real weight of the connection is finally felt. When two people are no longer in contact, the dynamic does not disappear. It simply moves inward. And in that inward space, something fundamental begins to reveal itself: who is emotionally centered and who is still emotionally orbiting. Power in human connection is often misunderstood. It is not about control, dominance, or who cares less. Real power is about stability. It belongs to the person whose emotional state is least dependent on the behavior of the other. The one who can remain grounded, calm, and whole without needing reassurance, explanation, or validation is the one who quietly becomes the center of gravity. When silence begins, both sides are initially affected. Both feel the disruption. Both feel the absence, but over time a divergence happens. One person may begin to regulate internally, to accept, to redirect energy toward their own life, purpose, and emotional balance. The other may remain mentally and emotionally focused on the connection, replaying, wondering, hoping, or resisting what is. This difference creates an invisible shift. The person who stabilizes emotionally stops leaning, their nervous system settles, their identity recenters, their sense of self is no longer anchored to the relationship or its outcome. They are no longer waiting to be chosen, contacted, or understood. They are choosing themselves. This is not emotional shutdown. This is emotional integration. They have felt the loss, processed it, and allowed it to become part of their story without letting it define their present. Their inner world becomes quiet, ordered, and forward-facing. The other person, even if they appear fine on the surface, may still be processing. Their emotional system may still be in motion, still unresolved, still oscillating between memories, questions, and imagined futures. They may still be oriented toward the connection as a reference point, even in silence. And here is where the shift of power occurs. Not because one person is winning, but because one person is centered. The emotionally grounded individual no longer emits need, tension, or seeking. Their energy becomes neutral, calm, and self-contained. This is felt even without contact. It changes the emotional field around the connection. The one who is still emotionally processing begins, often unconsciously, to feel this difference. They sense that the other is no longer waiting, no longer leaning, no longer available in the same way. The emotional balance that once existed is gone. The familiar polarity has changed. This creates a subtle internal response. The mind may say it's over, but the emotional system feels something has shifted. That shift is the relocation of the center. The grounded person becomes the point of reference, not because they demand attention, but because they are no longer seeking it. Their calm presence, even in absence, carries weight. It communicates wholeness, and wholeness is inherently stabilizing and attractive to the nervous system. The one who is less grounded may begin to feel the contrast between their inner movement and the other's stillness, between their emotional activity and the other's emotional quiet. This contrast can create curiosity, reflection, and sometimes a sense of imbalance, not imbalance in a manipulative sense, but in a natural, energetic sense. Human beings are drawn to stability when they are in motion. We are drawn to clarity when we are in confusion. We are drawn to grounding when we feel unsettled. The emotionally centered person becomes that point of grounding simply by being. This is why, in silence, the one who truly stabilizes gains the emotional center of the dynamic. They are no longer pulled by the past. They are no longer defined by the outcome. They are no longer negotiating with memory. They are present. Presence is power. Presence means your nervous system is regulated, your identity is intact, and your future is not dependent on reopening the past. You are not resisting what happened, and you are not clinging to what was. You are allowing life to move through you. This internal state shifts how the connection is held, even in memory. The grounded person is no longer associated with emotional chaos or need. They are associated with calm, strength, and self-respect. This changes how they are perceived and remembered, and more importantly, it changes how they experience themselves. They no longer ask, "Will this come back?" They ask, "Who am I becoming now?" That question is the mark of emotional leadership. Leadership of self is what creates true power, because the one who leads their own emotional world is not controlled by uncertainty, longing, or fear of loss. They are not waiting for circumstances to define their state. They define it from within. In silence, this difference becomes more and more pronounced. One person becomes rooted. The other may still be searching, and the rooted one becomes the center. Not by force, not by strategy, but by inner alignment. This is the quiet truth in no contact. Power does not go to the one who disappears, nor to the one who wants less. It goes to the one who becomes whole, and wholeness always becomes the gravitational center of any emotional field. Silence also reveals something deeper than emotion and power dynamics. It reveals identity. When contact stops, the masks that were held together by interaction slowly fall away, and what remains is the raw structure of how each person relates to themselves when no one is watching, validating, or responding. For one person, the absence becomes a mirror. They begin to see where they were over-giving, over-attaching, or losing their center. The mind replays moments not to suffer but to understand. Patterns become clear. They recognize where they compromised boundaries, ignored intuition, or placed the other person at the center of their emotional universe. And with that awareness, something shifts. They stop defining themselves by how they were loved or not loved. They begin defining themselves by how they choose to live, think, and carry themselves now. For the other person, silence can initially feel like freedom, relief, or even control. The external pressure is gone. The conversations, the expectations, the emotional weight, all of it is quiet. But once the noise fades, the inner world gets louder. Memory steps in, comparison steps in. The emotional body starts to process what the mind postponed while the relationship was active. And this is where identity begins to separate. One person starts rebuilding from the inside out. They restructure their self-image. They become disciplined with their thoughts, their habits, their purpose. They no longer wake up wondering what the other person is doing. They wake up focused on what they are becoming. Their energy stops flowing outward in need and starts circulating inward in growth. The other may still be unconsciously oriented toward the past, not necessarily wanting to return, but still referencing it, still measuring new experiences against old emotions, still carrying unfinished internal conversations. They may distract themselves, stay busy, socialize, even appear confident, yet the emotional system knows something is unresolved. Silence exposes this contrast. The person who has integrated the experience no longer feels defined by it. They can think about it without emotional charge. They can remember without longing. They can speak of it without tension in the body. That is not indifference, that is resolution. Resolution creates emotional gravity. When someone is internally resolved, they no longer emit the frequency of lack. They are not subtly asking life or another person to complete a story. Their story is already moving forward. Their nervous system is no longer scanning for signals from the past. It is oriented toward the present and the future. This changes how they show up energetically in the world. They become slower to react, more precise with words, less driven by impulse, and more guided by self-respect. Their standards rise, not because they are trying to prove something, but because they now understand their own value more clearly. They no longer tolerate emotional inconsistency, mixed signals, or half-presence, not out of pride, but out of clarity. The other person, sensing this shift, may not be able to name it logically, but they feel it. They feel that the emotional access they once had is no longer open by default. They feel that the familiar dynamic has changed. The person they once knew is no longer energetically available in the same way. There is a boundary now, even in silence. And boundaries, when they are calm and unspoken, carry immense psychological weight. Not because they punish, but because they signal self-definition. The grounded person is no longer asking, "Do you see my value now?" They are living as if their value is already known. This creates a subtle reversal of emotional orientation. The one who was once central becomes peripheral in the other's inner world, and the one who was once peripheral becomes central within themselves. This internal recentering is what shifts the emotional balance of the entire dynamic, even if no words are exchanged. Silence, then, becomes a sorting process. It separates attachment from selfhood. It separates longing from purpose. It separates emotional dependency from emotional sovereignty. And the one who emerges with a stronger sense of self, clearer boundaries, and a quieter nervous system becomes the one who is no longer defined by the outcome. They are defined by their direction. Direction is what creates presence. Presence is what creates influence. Influence is what reshapes the emotional field. So in the absence of contact, the real transformation is not about who reaches out first or who misses whom more. It is about who reconstructs their identity around wholeness instead of history. And when identity stabilizes, everything else naturally realigns around it. During silence, time becomes a judge that does not speak, but it observes everything. It watches what each person does when there is no emotional audience, no reassurance, no reaction, no validation. This is where the path quietly splits. One direction leads to growth, the other leads to stagnation. And whichever path is chosen determines not only how the future unfolds, but how the past will eventually be remembered. For some, the absence of contact creates discomfort, and they try to escape that discomfort instead of understanding it. They fill their days with distractions, rebounds, noise, and constant stimulation. They convince themselves they are fine, but inside, nothing has actually been processed. The same emotional patterns remain, the same wounds remain, the same fears remain. The only difference is they are buried under activity. This is stagnation. It looks like movement on the surface, but internally, nothing is changing. For others, silence becomes a laboratory, a place of observation, a place where they finally sit with their thoughts instead of running from them. They begin to analyze their role in what happened, not with self-blame, but with self-honesty. They see where they gave too much, where they tolerated too little, where they abandoned their own needs to keep a connection alive. They start correcting these patterns, not for the other person, but for themselves. This is growth. Growth is uncomfortable because it requires responsibility. It requires admitting that your emotional life, your boundaries, your standards, and your choices created your experiences. It means you stop seeing yourself as a victim of someone else's behavior and start seeing yourself as the architect of your future. While one person is numbing, the other is sharpening. While one is replaying the past, the other is redesigning their identity. While one is hoping for things to return to how they were, the other is building a version of themselves that will never accept what once felt normal. This difference compounds with time. The one who grows becomes emotionally lighter, clearer, more grounded. Their nervous system stabilizes. Their self-talk becomes calmer. Their presence becomes stronger. They no longer feel the urge to chase, prove, or seek closure. They already gave themselves closure by understanding the lesson. The one who stagnates becomes heavier internally, even if they appear confident externally. Unresolved emotions do not disappear. They linger. They resurface in quiet moments, in late nights, in unexpected memories, in subtle comparisons with new people. The mind keeps circling the same questions because no new answers were created. Silence magnifies this contrast. The growing person is no longer emotionally available in the same way. They are not cold, but they are complete. They are not closed, but they are selective. Their standards have shifted. Their tolerance for confusion, inconsistency, and half-effort has dropped. They have learned the cost of misaligned attachment, and they are no longer willing to pay it again. The stagnating person begins to sense this change energetically. They may not consciously think they have grown, but they feel that the emotional door is no longer open by default. The familiar dynamic is gone. The comfort of being central in someone's emotional world is no longer guaranteed. And this creates a subtle internal tension, because humans are deeply sensitive to contrast. When someone evolves while you remain the same, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. The memory of who they were collides with the reality of who they are becoming, and this gap creates reflection, regret, and sometimes a desire to reconnect, not necessarily out of love, but out of the discomfort of realizing that you were a chapter they outgrew. This is why growth during silence is so powerful. It is not about trying to impress. It is not about trying to make someone come back. It is about becoming someone who would never again accept the old dynamic. The transformation is internal, but its impact is external. Stagnation keeps the emotional story unfinished. Growth completes it. And completion is magnetic because it carries peace. When you are at peace with what was, you no longer chase what could have been. You no longer need validation from the past. You no longer measure your worth by whether someone returns. You stand in a different psychological position, a higher one. That position changes everything. It changes how you walk into rooms. It changes how you speak. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you attract. So when silence stretches on, understand this time is not just passing. It is shaping. It is revealing. It is separating those who evolve from those who repeat. And in that separation, the future is quietly being decided. When two people stop contacting each other, what eventually rises to the surface is not just emotion, not just memory, not just power or curiosity. What rises is the truth of the bond itself. Silence removes all the noise that once blurred reality. No good mornings, no late night talks, no reassurance, no conflict, no validation, just time in the mind. And in that space, a single question begins to answer itself. Was the connection built on need, or was it built on choice? Need feels urgent. It feels anxious. It feels like something is missing when the other person is gone. The mind searches for their presence because it used them as a source of stability, identity, or emotional regulation. When contact stops, a person driven by need feels ungrounded. Their mood depends on whether they hear from the other. Their sense of worth depends on being remembered. Their peace depends on being wanted. Silence for them is not quiet, it is loud. It is uncomfortable. It is threatening because it exposes how much of their emotional center was outsourced. Choice is different. Choice is calm. Choice is grounded. Choice says, I value you, but I am whole without you. When contact stops, a person rooted in choice may feel the absence, but they are not destabilized by it. They do not lose their identity. They do not collapse into overthinking. They reflect, they process, they grow, but they remain centered. Their life continues to move forward because it was never built around one emotional attachment. Silence makes this contrast impossible to hide. At first, both may feel the quiet. Both may think about each other. Both may replay moments. But over time, their inner experiences diverge. The one who was attached through need keeps circling the same emotional loops. They wonder, they hope, they regret, they imagine scenarios. Their energy remains tied to the past. The one who is connected through choice begins to integrate the experience. They learn from it. They extract meaning. They release what no longer serves them. Their energy slowly detaches and returns to their own life, their own direction, their own purpose. This is where the truth of the connection reveals itself. If love was based on need, the absence creates anxiety, longing, and a desire to restore the familiar, even if it was unhealthy. If love was based on choice, the absence creates clarity. You can see what was real, what was forced, what was aligned, and what was simply attachment wearing the mask of intimacy. And here is the part most people do not realize. The moment you move from need to choice within yourself, your entire emotional position changes. You are no longer asking to be chosen. You are choosing. You are no longer waiting to be valued. You are valuing yourself. You are no longer hoping someone returns to make you whole. You are whole whether they return or not. This internal shift is subtle but powerful. It changes your nervous system. It changes your energy. It changes the way you think, speak, and carry yourself. You become less reactive, less desperate, less emotionally exposed. You become more grounded, more selective, more self-directed. You stop chasing connection and start embodying it. And when someone senses that the bond they once had with you is no longer rooted in need, something happens inside them. They feel the difference between being wanted and being chosen. They feel the difference between being needed and being respected. They feel the difference between emotional dependency and emotional sovereignty. Need creates comfort, but it also creates pressure. Choice creates attraction because it is free. When you no longer need someone, but you could choose them, your presence carries weight. Your silence carries meaning. Your absence is not a void of longing, but a statement of self-respect. And that is when the emotional memory of you changes in the other person's mind. You are no longer stored as someone who was attached. You are stored as someone who was grounded. This is the final revelation of silence. It shows whether the connection was two people leaning on each other to fill inner gaps, or two complete individuals choosing to walk together. It shows whether love was a compensation for loneliness or a meeting of strength. It shows whether what existed was emotional dependency or emotional alignment. And once you see this, you no longer fear silence. You no longer fear distance. You no longer fear loss. Because you understand that what is meant to be chosen will return freely, not out of need, not out of guilt, not out of emptiness, but out of genuine alignment. And if it does not return, you still stand whole, centered, and unshaken, because your life is no longer built on being needed, but on knowing your worth and choosing your path.